Was it traumatic? Not the election, silly. I mean us taking a whole week off to get through the election. Well, I'm back, and I have lots of thoughts about the election, and most of it is not about the presidential race. This is Jonathan Tassini, and it's great to have you with us for our show for November 11th, 2020. Our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union, which fights for dignity and respect for its 200,000 members and retirees, as well as private sector workers. As usual, I hope you will consider signing up for the show at our YouTube channel, Working Life with Jonathan Tassini. It's free to sign up, but it helps us build the audience for the video product. You'll still get the audio podcast if that's how you like to get the show, but please do sign up for the show at the YouTube channel. And please do consider becoming a patron of the show. You can do that in two ways. You can go over to workinglife.org and look for the podcast tab and follow that link over to Patreon, where you can become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. Or you can also become a financial supporter through ActBlue, because we've partnered up with ActBlue, and you can sign up to be a sponsor, again, on a one-time basis or a monthly basis at our Working Life Network site at ActBlue. So the first question I want to throw out to you is this: how does Tom Perez, the chair of the Democratic National Committee, still have a job? Come on. In most democracies, certainly in Europe, the countries I'm familiar with, it is pretty common for the head of a party to resign quickly, as in the day after an election when a party just screws up so much. Now, Tom Perez has been so incompetent for a very long time, and I've pointed that out on this show and in other places. He was the choice of the Democratic Party elites back in 2016. A guy who had never really run for office to speak of and knows zippo about the mechanics of an election. And voila! His party, the Democratic Party, lost seats in the House of Representatives. It fumbled the chance to take back the U.S. Senate, and that's now 3 cycles in a row. And even worse, it failed to take back legislative chambers at the state level. Perez's failures will echo for years to come. Want to know how that screws millions of people? Mitch McConnell, one of the most amoral politicians in my lifetime, which says a lot, a guy who has no overriding ideology other than his own power, he has a shot at continuing to run the United States Senate. That's after the Democratic Party blew at least 2, if not 3, very winnable races with a weak-ass campaign. And money was not the problem. I mean, hell, 2 candidates who were obvious losers in Kentucky and South Carolina blew through a combined $200 million. 2 races that I said long ago were a colossal waste of time, money, and energy. Now, this isn't just about politics. This is about the lives of millions of people. Millions of people are losing their homes because they can't pay the rent. They've lost their jobs. They can't pay for food. And they have spent all their savings. And month after month, Republicans have blocked real aid to the people. Now, yes, on this show, I pointed out the Democrats' proposal back in May in the House was not enough. I've said many times we need a $5 to $6 trillion stimulus package, part of which would guarantee the incomes of every person up to $90,000 a year. But the McConnell crime gang, as I call it, filled with multimillionaires and corporate hacks, thinks that people who get an extra $600 a week just to get them through the pandemic are making too much money. Now, the state legislative races that I mentioned, the ones that the party failed at winning, are even more disastrous. You all know this. You're politically smart. Next year, the lines for congressional seats will be redrawn and then be in place for a full decade. Those lines are generally drawn by legislatures and governors to protect incumbents. And if one party controls all the branches of government, then basically they mostly get your pick. Check this out. Republicans have the trifecta, meaning both houses of a legislature and the governorship in 23 states, 23 states. And they have a lot more power in more states that allow them to pretty much block any good districts or get their way. That means that for the next decade, plenty of lunatics will still be elected to Congress. Lunatics like McConnell and his following, as well as people who follow the QAnon conspiracy theories, Proud Boy followers, all racists and bigots. In other words, they are going to be opposed to any progressive ideas, any progressive policy. And still, Tom Perez still has a job. Not to mention the other party operative hacks who make huge paychecks and lose cycle after cycle. Which is why, to me, my second point, we all need to focus on Georgia, Georgia, Georgia. Now, look, I'm no big fan of Chuck Schumer and other weak Democrats in the Senate and in Congress. But truth is, these two races in Georgia, the runoff races, will mean the difference between millions of people being able to pay for food or keep their homes. Not to mention whether people like Bernie Sanders, Sherrod Brown, Jeff Merkley, and Elizabeth Warren will have real power at the head of important committees, or instead be stuck in the minority for at least 2 more years, and then they'll have no chance to fight with the Biden administration over a real progressive agenda. So those two races have to be won. Now, all of the above brings me really to a final point, which is really a positive take on some stuff from the election. I don't want to just be a negative observer here. In a lot of ways, I'm becoming more and more interested in local political efforts. And to hell with the candidates, the ballot initiatives really are where we can win lots of power. And there's lots of good stuff to show in this recent election. Check this out. While Democrats in the Biden campaign were blowing Florida, an entirely winnable state, in my opinion, if there had been a competent campaign, and we can dig into that some other time, at the same time, voters were overwhelmingly approving by a 60% plus margin a ballot measure to hike the state minimum wage to $15 an hour. Which makes you wonder, why didn't the Biden campaign and the state party Democrats Velcro themselves to this ballot measure, which was so popular? And it will mean something real for lots of people. Now let's head over west to Arizona and look at this. By a margin of more than 116,000 votes at the time that I'm speaking to you now, the margin will probably grow. Voters said yes to a tax hike to fund education, meaning higher salaries for teachers, school aides, bus drivers, and other folks. Not to mention higher spending per student, which will mean smaller class sizes. The 3.5% tax is only on the wealthiest folks, individuals making more than $250,000 a year, and couples making more than $500,000 a year. And that victory was by far a bigger margin than the less than 15,000 votes that Biden has won Arizona by. Maybe that margin for him will grow a little bit, but not substantially. Now, here's the obvious point. People will get behind ideas that confront class warfare. They will support higher taxes for things that improve communities. I was going to say bold ideas, but really, paying a teacher a living wage and making a classroom a place that every kid can learn should not be a bold idea. It should be a no-brainer in a semi-decent society. So to talk more about that ballot win for teachers, it's great to welcome David Lujan, the executive director of the Arizona Center for Economic Progress, which played a central role in the campaign. So maybe to start out, David, for my audience, let's give a little background on how this ballot initiative evolved and how it came to be. I assume part of this had to do with the Red for Ed movement, which was so powerful in your state and other states, in which we covered on this podcast.
Yes, the Prop 208 was really four or more years in the making. Arizona, no state in the country had cut more from its public education funding than Arizona during the Great Recession. And so we are feeling the ramifications of that in the form of one of the worst teacher shortage crisis and some of the largest class sizes. And so 2018 was the Red for Ed movement, where we had one of the largest teacher walkouts. We had 75,000 teachers marching on our state capitol. And so we brought a similar ballot initiative in 2018 that ended up getting removed by our state Supreme Court. And our coalition decided, we weren't going to give up because we recognized we still had a funding crisis, and we still recognized that we had a good policy that voters supported, because we had done lots of polling to show that voters would support this. And so we said we would be back in 2020 if they didn't fix the funding crisis in our schools. And so we were back, and we were able to get it over the finish line.
So a couple of details there, something you mentioned. Why did the state Supreme Court remove it from the ballot? What was the reasoning? Was it some technical thing that was wrong with it?
It was a technicality that,
Oh,
and we had also, that was our opposition, was using that tactic of using a very stacked state Supreme Court to try and get it removed. And so we took that and learned from it and restructured the proposal to make sure that it would withstand any sort of legal challenges this time. And so that was really instrumental in getting it passed this year.
and the second thing you mentioned about teacher salaries and generally funding, you had a terrific report out in September 2020, and I urge my audience to go to the Arizona Center for Economic Progress website and read this report, because it really gives the background to this. And I want to just highlight a couple of things that you pointed out, that the per pupil instruction spending in 2018 was 13% lower than it was in 2009. And just a little bit below that, you then talk about teacher salaries, which again, we covered here on this podcast back in April of 2018. Teacher salaries in Arizona are also not faring well when compared to teachers nationwide. In 2000, Arizona's teachers earned 19% less than the national average. And no surprise, you then have a teacher shortage in Arizona because people don't want to try to earn a living on such meager wages. Where I remember when I was covering the Red for Ed movement in Arizona and other states, there were teachers, and I want to emphasize this, there were teachers who had to go to food banks in order to make it to the end of the month to make sure their families had food in the United States of America.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's still, you hear stories of teachers having to work 2 or 3 jobs. They're working as servers in restaurants on the night, in the evenings and the weekends in order to make ends meet. And it's only made our teacher shortage crisis worse. And then you combine the COVID pandemic. We had more than 1,700 classrooms this year without a qualified certified teacher. And so this was so critical for our schools to get them the resources they need and to really address the funding crisis that we have in our schools in Arizona.
So let's talk specifically. What does the proposition do now?
It establishes a 3.5% income tax surcharge on taxpayers who earn above $500,000 a year if they are married couples, or above $250,000 a year if you're a single filer. And so it establishes that surcharge only on the taxable income above those amounts. So anything that they earn below those amounts are taxed just as it is currently, but anything they earn above that has this 3.5% surcharge on their taxable income. It basically taxes the top 1% of the wealthiest Arizonans.
Mm-hmm. And in your computations that you've done at the center, and I assume along with the teachers union and other advocates, is that going to be enough to make up that gap that we just discussed in terms of basically dealing with class size, teacher salaries? I noted that the money is going to be used, at least I'm quoting here from a newspaper article, to increase the salaries of teachers, nurses, counselors, classroom aides, and bus drivers.
Right. Yes. So we had our Arizona Department of Revenue did a revenue estimate of this proposal, and their estimate for us that they did says it'll raise about $940 million a year in new revenue. And so that will be the single largest new investment in our public schools in more than 20 years. And so
Wow.
it really is going to be transformational. It'll address our teacher shortage crisis and it'll definitely be a big boost for our schools.
Now, what's amazing to me when it comes to teachers, and you can find this in many states, you have lots of, say, anti-tax people, conservatives, even some people in companies who are against any kind of tax increases in general, but even to help education. And what is stunning to me, and I know you addressed this in your report, they don't look at the big picture, which is if you don't have teachers who are paid well, who are there to instruct the generation of the future, that ends up, putting aside the moral argument here, that ends up hurting the economy and the productivity because obviously companies need, future workers who are going to have skills, and it's all connected. If you don't pay folks enough to then have kids be able to get the kinds of education they need, then
Exactly.
you're going to hurt the economy eventually, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was probably the most perplexing and disappointing thing, is to see that our opposition, who spent more than $20 million in trying to defeat us, were many of the big business groups in Arizona, the Arizona Chamber of Commerce, the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce. And yet, if you have listened to our CEOs over the last few years, when they've been asked and when they've done surveys, they have said, like, what's one of the biggest obstacles to growing our economy in Arizona? And they've consistently said over the years, it's the lack of funding for our public education system. And yet, when we had a proposal on, they were the biggest opponents, and they did everything they could to try and defeat this, mainly because it was the CEOs who are in that top 1% who didn't want to see their own taxes increased. But yes, you're exactly right. If you talk to most economists, they'll say one of the most smartest investments states can make to improve their economy, to grow their workforce, is to invest in their public education system. So we've been saying all along, this is going to be good for our economy. This is good for our workforce. And so I think our business leaders are going to start to see that now, but they don't like the fact that the CEOs are going to have to pay a little bit more in taxes.
As my father used to say, "My heart bleeds for them," or some people say, "Let me take out the smallest violin, to, accompany their tears." By the way, let's make the broader point, those kinds of investments beyond education, I know you've done a lot of work on this too, infrastructure, all those kinds of things that make an economy vibrant, paid sick leave, for example, all the things that kind of construct a social network, those are important too for a healthy economy, and those are things that have been opposed by those chamber of commerces mostly, and businesses not just in Arizona but throughout the country. And you could argue that that kind of failed investment, the failure to invest in those things, has really hobbled the nation's economy overall.
Yes, for sure. Arizona has actually passed a number of progressive policies over the years at the ballot box, not through the legislature, but at the ballot box. And in 2016, we passed a minimum wage law that the same people who were opposing us in Prop 208 this year were the same ones who opposed the minimum wage. And it was funny that they used the exact same arguments, that if we increased the minimum wage, it was going to hurt business, it was going to hurt our economy, businesses were going to leave. And we've now had that minimum wage law in Arizona for 3 years, and we've seen a lot of positive, none of the negative claims that they made. And that's what we were saying in this campaign, that this is just all of these sort of sky is falling doomsday scenarios that our opposition put out there just aren't consistent with what we know to be true, is that when you invest in these things, that helps your economy, it helps people move up the economic ladder.
So let's now talk a little bit about the bigger picture. You and I talked a little bit offline about this element of what does this mean going forward and what are the lessons to learn. One of the things that struck me throughout the election is how many progressive policies passed throughout the country despite what happened in individual races. So, for example, in Florida, which was heavily contested in the presidential race, and Donald Trump won that relatively comfortably. On the other hand, at the same time, 60% of people in Florida voted in favor of raising the minimum wage, the state minimum wage, to $15 an hour, which we would consider to be a progressive step. So, in one sense, voters chose, in the vernacular, a more conservative choice at the presidential level. But when you actually talked about pocketbook issues and things that mattered at the kitchen table, when it mattered to people thinking about what they would have to uh, look for in terms of their income and the ability to pay bills, a huge majority supported that in Florida. It's true here too in Arizona. Again, this may have changed, but the initiative, Prop 208, passed with a difference of about 116,000 votes. Now, it may be even bigger since the article because they've continued to count votes. The presidential race was quite a bit more narrower. So the bottom line is, what did you take from that in terms of what you saw statewide and how you appeal to people going forward about these progressive kind of ideas?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, we've done dozens and dozens of polls on this policy and this issue over the last 4 years. And it's been consistent that Arizonans recognize that we have an upside down tax code, that they recognize that the wealthy are getting the tax breaks. And so they've supported this policy. So it's interesting that statewide voters passed progressive policies in Arizona, but yet we were hoping that, I think the Democrats were hoping that the chamber and the legislature were going to flip both in the House and the Senate, and they actually ended up just staying basically the status quo. Republicans will have a 1 seat advantage in both chambers. And when you look at it, I looked at the precinct by precinct map of our proposition yesterday, and it was really interesting that in the urban areas of Phoenix and Tucson, that's where a lot of the support came from Prop 208. But if you look in the rural areas, that's where most precincts voted against Proposition 208. And it's really interesting because when you talk about a tax on the wealthy, on the top 1%, very few of the people that are in that top 1% live in those rural areas. And also more money for education. In many of the rural areas, the public schools tend to be some of the largest employers. So the rural area economies tend to gain from Prop 208 by the additional money that's going to go into teacher salaries and creating jobs. So it's really interesting that in the rural areas they voted against their interests. I mean, they didn't stand to be harmed by any sort of tax increase, and they really will get the benefits of the additional revenue. And I think that's where I see in Arizona in particular, but probably nationally too, is that we need to do a better job in those rural areas of just informing people about what these policies mean and how they impact their pocketbook. Because I think that particularly in the urban areas, people get it, at least in Phoenix and in Tucson. But in the rural areas of Arizona, even though Prop 208 would bring a lot of benefits and very little, harm, they voted against it.
And I would assume, at least this is true in some rural areas in other parts of the country, maybe not in Arizona, schools tend to be even more underfunded in rural areas as well because of the tax base is not as strong. Is that correct too in Arizona?
For sure, yes. And another aspect of Prop 208 is it will more than double state funding for vocational programs, which are huge for rural areas for their workforce development. And so, yeah, that's probably, I think, one of the most perplexing things, but I think an area where we have a lot to learn from this is that, why is it that people in rural areas voted against this, but the majority of people in the urban areas voted for it?
Do you have an answer for that since you raised the question? Or is it
Yeah.
still perplexing other than it's oftentimes because at least progressive Democrats, however you wanna frame it, don't know how to talk about taxes that well, and for years, for now going back decades, Republicans have dominated this, discussion in the language they use, and even people who are going to benefit from this, certainly people who are not gonna be taxed, as you point out from Prop 208, it's only higher earners, but when people hear tax hikes, they automatically think they're coming after my pocketbook, no matter what you say.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think part of it is organizations like mine, we have to do a better job of reaching out into the rural areas. We've had a lot more presence in urban areas in recent years. And Arizona for years was a conservative state, but nationally people are putting money into organizations like mine to help kind of change that. And we're starting in the urban areas, but now we need to get more into the rural areas to put some of our materials and just talk to people in rural areas about policies and what are the policies that will help them to move up the economic ladder. So I think we need to really be focusing more on those rural areas. going forward.
And that means, I assume, actually placing resources, boots on the ground, for lack of a better term, organizers who work in the communities on a regular basis. And also, it seems to me, I'm going to speak now nationally. I don't know, again, the politics of Arizona that well in terms of the people who speak about this, but Democrats, people who have been speaking about taxes, they're afraid to talk about this. And it seems like too often they're mealy mouthed about it. And honestly, again, I don't know the context in Arizona, but part of the problem is the Democratic Party has repeatedly been afraid to talk about higher taxes, partly because, let's face it, the party, many candidates are funded by wealthy people, have very strong ties to corporate interest. And so they don't want to talk about taxes because they're afraid that maybe the spigot might be turned off in terms of money coming to the party. I'm being very concrete about it.
Right. No, I think you're right. And we do have to talk about it though, because people, when you talk about it and you explain how these things work, people get it. I mean, that's why this passed in Arizona, is because we've spent a lot of time over the last few years, educating Arizona voters that of all the tax breaks that corporations and the wealthy have been getting, and how we have one of the most regressive state tax codes. And we saw that people in Arizona, at least in the urban areas, got that. They understood that where the tax breaks have been going. But I don't think we've been doing enough of that. And maybe it is because we're afraid to talk about this in rural areas. But I think we have to start having those discussions and those conversations more so in rural areas, and say and just show how some of these tax breaks and tax cuts over the years are not benefiting people in rural communities, and how it's hurting investments, and how it's hurting their own opportunities to have better lives. And so that's where I think a lot of our work has to focus going forward, is changing that dynamic.
Mm-hmm. And last question to ask you, to what extent was there a racial component to this? Meaning, where you have in rural areas a community that has less people of color, where, especially in urban areas, funding for schools, let's face it, funding for schools for people of color in schools throughout the country is always disadvantaged compared to rural suburban areas. And I'm wondering whether you saw a racial breakdown as well here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, a lot of the aspect that Arizona is turning blue, or we voted for President Biden, and we have a second Democratic U.S. senator. A lot of that's attributable to the organizing that's going on in communities of color, and that's where we've focused a lot of our efforts in really, talking about how these disinvestments are hurting communities of color. And so, and we have to continue that. We have to continue to build upon that. But I think also now, we have to have those conversations in rural communities and say, it's also impacting you, that these disinvestments are hurting your workforce. They're hurting your ability to create those economic opportunities as well, because it's not just the schools that are in communities of color that are being disinvested. It's also in the rural areas that are being impacted as well. And so I think going forward, like I said, that's I think where we have to start to put more emphasis.
Well, your work has been great. We've talked before, and the fact that the Proposition 208 passed was one of the bright lights in this election in terms of, the political realities. So thanks very much for being on the show. We'll track this, and we'll have you back to kind of update us about how it's going.
Sure. Thank you.
That'll do it for this week's show. Thanks to my guest, David Lujan. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Our major sponsors, the American Postal Workers Union. Please do support this show in two ways. First of all, go over to our YouTube channel and subscribe to the channel there. It helps us build the audience so this video product gets spread far and wide. And of course, please consider becoming a financial sponsor of the show. You can do that in two ways. Go over to workinglife.org, look for our podcast tab, and then find your way over to Patreon, where you can become a sponsor either on a one-time basis or on a regular basis. Or, as I say, often we've partnered up with Act Blue. You might be more comfortable and familiar with Act Blue through your political donations. We've partnered up with Act Blue, so go over to Act Blue, look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and sign up there either as a sponsor on a one-time basis or a monthly basis. Hey, thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.